Fantastic. Welcome everybody, amazing group of people. It's extremely exciting to be with you today. So I'm part of a mapping group, Land Food Mappers, which comes under the umbrella of UAC. And we've been meeting regularly on Zoom for probably over a year now. And essentially, we've been sharing ideas about how to map land for food. Many people are very, very experienced mappers, and so they share their methodologies. And there's a lot of conversation about how we might collaborate more, how we might then share this information with landowners, how we might escalate food growing, especially in the urban setting. So this is our chance today to highlight some of this work, to show where people are already working with local authorities very successfully, and to talk to people starting out on that journey and what might that look like. How can mappers really facilitate this mapping? Why is it so important? Why do we need to understand how to map our land? Well, hopefully some of those questions will be answered today. So there's a lovely phrase that one of our members uses, and he says, we're all on a journey and every journey starts with a map. And I love that. I think that's a good way to start today's session. So I'm going to hand to Maddie, because we've got this amazingly packed agenda. Hopefully it'll be super exciting for you. I think something that maybe Maddie hasn't said is, if there are questions, there's so many people in the room, put them in the chat and we'll hopefully manage them through the chat rather than hand raising. So without any more blather, please, I'm going to hand over to Maddie for the first part of the session.
Thanks, Janie. So we'll be starting off, I'll just give you a little run of the flow of the session. We'll be starting off with a short visualization. Maps are a very visual thing, and so it'd be good to get ourselves into that space. Then we'll be sharing with each other. We'll have a short time for very small breakouts where we share what came up in that visualization. We'll then hear from some brilliant mapping projects, and first of all from one of the mappers in our group, Mark Thurstain, who has been part of it from the very beginning, and who has some great wisdom about how we approach mapping for urban food and peri-urban food. Mark will give a short kind of overview of that. And we'll then hear from Resilient Green Spaces project, which is a Wales-wide food mapping project. We'll then have a short break. We'll come back and we'll hear from Lambeth, borough of Lambeth in London, and then from Leeds. So there's some fantastic stuff going on. Everyone's at different stages. We really want it to be useful for local authorities as well, to start imagining what is possible when you start with the right kind of map, and how you might create that as a collaborative endeavour, and where that might lead. Mark will then sum up, and we'll have just a brief sort of kind of next steps. So that's the plan. So to kick us off, I would like to invite you all just to find yourselves in a comfortable position. Maybe close your eyes if you want to. Take a breath. With your feet on the ground, place yourself somewhere outside in your town or city. Now, from there, let yourself ascend. Maybe you're in a hot air balloon, maybe you're a bird. You feel yourself rise up and up, and your place around you starts to stretch out on all sides. What time of year is it? And what you start to see around you as you look down, as you zoom out, is a productive landscape. Plots of all shapes and sizes, maybe rooftops. What's on the edges? Maybe you see market gardens, maybe winding orchards. And keep ascending until you can see all of your place, right to the edges and beyond. What does that look like? So you see the whole, a living map, and you can hover there like a skylark. What does it feel like? Can you zoom in and see what's happening in some of these places? Perhaps the people, what do you notice? What do you notice about the plants, the activity, perhaps the biodiversity? Notice what's drawing your eye. How far does it reach? Out and in to the center. This is what was created, beginning with a map, the creating of a map. Which led to land being designated for food production. And notice what you see from your own perspective. Maybe you're a grower, maybe you're a planner, maybe you're someone else from within a local authority, maybe you're a campaigner. What do you notice from your own unique perspective? And what is it all achieving? For people, for land, for the economy, for health. What is it all achieving? For climate, for biodiversity. Now, we're going to invite you, whilst holding on to that image, into breakout rooms, which Janie has been setting up. There'll be 2 or 3 of you. And in the chat, there's a Mentimeter link. Maybe you've opened it already. If you haven't, just click on that. You don't all have to type into that, but someone in each breakout room. And I want you to share with each other just who you are and where you are and what you noticed about what was happening. What did your map look like? What did your place look like? And what was it achieving from your perspective? And type into the Mentimeter in your conversation just a few things, a few key things that you want to share. So you have about 5 minutes, and Janie, go ahead. I might pause the recording.
There's 3 groups that haven't gone. I'm wondering if I should just press join. Oh, there we go. I think if I...
Hiya, I just came back out because it was only me in the breakout room.
Oh, that's no good. What's your... Is that Anna?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, I'll sign you to another room.
I got kicked out on that. Thank you.
Not everyone's been assigned.
A short introduction.
This meeting is being recorded.
Just happy to give a short introduction to the presentations we're gonna see. I mean, I first started getting involved in mapping and food back in 2008. This was with Somerset Community Food and Incredible Edible Somerset. This was back in the heady days of when Google Maps first came out. So everyone got very, very excited. And in fact, in my industry, in my trade, Google Maps changed everything because it democratized access to mapping technology and access to mapping data. And I think that's a really important thing to hold on to and think about as we listen to the presentations shortly. However, at the time when it started, we were kind of commissioned by Somerset Community Food to develop a tool to record land parcels that were possibly suitable for food production, small-scale food production across the county. But at the time in Google Maps, you couldn't record any information directly, so we actually had to write some software to enable people to log on and collect information on land parcels and record them on the map base. And the project was very, very successful, certainly for Somerset Community Food in terms of identifying the range of potential parcels. It gave them an insight to hotspots of potential activity, because of course, as a crowdsourced activity, what we found was that there were certain parts of the county that were more engaged than others. And this, for both Somerset Community Food and Incredible Edible Somerset, was a really useful insight. The other thing, of course, is once you've got a map, it's a very powerful device to communicate, not only to people who may be interested in growing food, but crucially also to decision makers in local authorities and so forth. And that was a very important output. However, and I don't want to kind of bring things down, but we made a few mistakes in that project, and I think it's something to bear in mind as we listen to some of the projects going forward and how we think about mapping in this context. The fact that the data were crowdsourced, and a lot of the time the data will be crowdsourced because local people have better local knowledge. We saw an initial surge of interest with people recording land parcels, and then quickly it tailed off, the interest tailed off. So I think that a key thing to consider is how we can maintain interest in these mapping exercises. And indeed in that project, when we started to look at the user logs, who had contributed, by about 6 months in, it was basically staff at Somerset Community Food who were doing most of the mapping work, as kind of interest had waned to some degree. The other issue was that over the lifespan of the project, the data started to, what I would say, describe it as, data started to go stale. Something really important to think about when we're mapping. Just because we put data on the map doesn't mean that that information about those land parcels is going to stay the same forever. They change, and we always need to think about data curation and kind of keeping them the data live and checking it and making sure that it's still extant, and that, for example, a land parcel hasn't disappeared or been bought or what have you. And also kind of related to that, which is, I don't want to sound too grim, but that the project, eventually the project had to wind up. It wound up in 2015, when basically the software we'd written was no longer supported by Google, and we couldn't interface with Google Maps. And the project came to a very hard stop. Now, to be fair, by that time, not many people were using the mapping tool, even though it had been kind of online and linked to the Somerset Community Food site for some time. But that actually was, you might think it's strange, the end of life of the project was a real pain in the backside for us. And certainly one of the things that I would think about when we're looking at mapping projects is not to think that they could necessarily go on forever, that they may have a lifespan, and that we need to think about how we tidy things up tidily at the end, and also kind of dispose of the data or share the data with other people who might want to take it forward. With those minor caveats, there's no doubt that that this project was a success, and certainly led to greater engagement with For Incredible Edibles Somerset and Somerset Community Food, not only with their local communities, but also with key decision makers in the local authorities and with landowners and so on. And I think that's something to really hold on to. Something that I know we were visualizing maps at the beginning of this session, but really it's the visual impact of the map that I think needs to be held on to, because it does engage with key stakeholders. Okay, I will be popping back later just to kind of reflect on some of the projects we're going to hear about now. So perhaps if I hand back to you, Maddie, and you can introduce our first speakers.
Thank you, Mark. Brilliant. Yeah, so I'd like to introduce Alison from Social Farms and Gardens in Wales, who is coordinating the Resilient Green Spaces project. I think Lynn is also here from Digital Commons and Land Explorer, and they're working collaboratively on this project. Over to you.
Thanks, Maddie, and thanks, Mark, for that. We're at the completely other end of the spectrum to where Mark's come from, so relatively new to all of this, and kind of at the start of our project, so really taking on board some of those things that Mark's talked about in terms of legacy, which has been something we've been thinking about. So just as a brief introduction, I would say I am very grateful for this opportunity, because next week we're at the Wales Real Food and Farming Conference, delivering a session or a practical workshop facilitating that on mapping. So this is a nice little trial run for us a little bit. So please bear with us on this. Social Farms and Gardens, who I work for, is a UK-wide organisation. We support community growing across the UK, city farms, community orchards, community gardens, allotments, all sorts of different organisations, just getting people out there kind of to their full potential through nature, really, and food growing. So the Resilient Green Spaces partnership, which hopefully you can see on your screens, we've got this fantastic kind of diagram of what it's going on, because it's a huge project that's EU funding that's been issued through the Welsh Government. It's a 2-year project that ends in June 2023. This kind of shows all the different work streams that are going on and being led by various different partners, including Lantra, Land Workers Alliance, Development Trust Association Wales, Shared Assets, Gwynedd County Council, Cardiff University and Open Food Network, as well as Social Farms and Gardens. So we're looking at all sorts of different things. So it seems like it was a kind of fantastic opportunity, really, to we've got all these partners bringing all of their knowledge together. Let's get some of that onto a map so it can be visually seen. And that, I guess that was kind of where it came from, really. But actually, we really wanted to think about why are we mapping it, and how are we going to kind of ensure that legacy of the data that's collated. And something that Maddie put on our kind of brief before we were talking was around making, why do we map? Because maps help to translate our food strategy into land use decisions. And that's really something that's kind of been quite integral to this. So as an organisation, Social Farms and Gardens had done quite a lot of mapping for Welsh Government before, and we'd popped it all onto a pinpoint map, which was hosted by some American company, Batch Geo, where we could pinpoint everything and we could divvy it all up. So we had incredible edible sites, allotments, orchards, and then our members, the community gardens as well. And one of the issues, as Mark's pointed out there, is that, you know, it's all great, but it's kind of it's potentially out of date so rapidly. And also one of the other issues that we did find was that it wasn't actually didn't have that interoperability with other data holders. So there's some really great data sets out there with Natural Resource Wales, with Welsh Government, and with local authorities in terms of green infrastructure, in terms of flood drainage, in terms of agricultural knowledge, in terms of health indices. And actually what we want to be able to do was to contribute community food growing into that bigger conversation. So it was about making sure that our knowledge was in a format that could be overlaid with some of their data that they'd already got. But it's kind of based on that assumption. We don't want to duplicate work, and that while our priority is around community food growing, actually that's not necessarily high on the agenda or high on the kind of radar of local authorities or policymakers. So we needed to make sure that the data that we held, where we could demonstrate what our impact was, could be really easily shared, and it could be shared alongside their data so it could make sense, and then those kind of policy recommendations could be drawn out of that. I actually have to admit I don't actually know which slide is coming next, so hopefully I'm making sense. What I'm saying is going to match up with what I thought I was going to say. Perfect. So basically within Resilient Green Spaces, obviously we've got project funding, so we've got a little bit of capacity in there, and it gave us an opportunity to work with an emerging organisation called Digital Commons, and I've just popped up on there what their kind of statement is, and believing that land is a common good and that should deliver shared benefits for everyone, which is very much what we believe as well, and the partnership across Resilient Green Spaces. And so our funding basically gave us quite an opportunity to provide a bit of additional capacity for the development of the Digital Commons platform, which is Land Explorer, and particularly give it a bit of a Wales focus, because I know I say I'm from Shropshire here, and I am, and you'll notice all the people I can see have got their cameras on in Wales. It's nice and sunny, and it's not here, but I am representing Wales today. So the key thing about the Land Explorer map is that it's open source, and that kind of again sits in with its ethos of co-production, of ownership, of forming the data in a way that's useful for multiple stakeholders, and ensuring that open exchange, collaborative participation, transparency. So that's why we're working with Digital Commons, and Lynn Davis from Digital Commons is here today, and she's the technical expert, so can answer any technical questions that people have. This is just a screenshot of what we've got on Land Explorer so far. So it's based, I believe, on Ordnance Survey data kind of the base layer. And across England, there's really good additional data around agricultural land and historic flood maps and all that kind of stuff, which is yet to be brought into Wales. But we have said, because of that idea that we want to then be able to export our data, actually that we're not having that as a priority. We're not looking for this map to hold all of the data that there possibly could be that might impact community food growing, because as we know, it's absolutely integral to so many different areas. So what we're trying to do is pop as much useful stuff onto here that can then be taken out and used elsewhere as people see fit. So currently I've just flagged up the allotments, and you can flag up the different sites. So we've been using the social farms and gardens data as a bit of a kind of sample really to start working with. And as new iterations of Land Explorer come forward with new functionality, just kind of looking at how we expand that and what's next. And then I think this is just a page with some of the questions we've been asking as we're kind of going through the co-production phase of developing this. So, you know, how do we manage the open access with the integrity? How do we ensure that it's continuing to be relevant? And if we're not mapping everything, is it relevant? And if we miss stuff, what does that mean? And so there's like so many questions, and that's really exciting, where because I have a tendency to go into a meeting like, right, this is what needs to happen and this is how it's going to be done. And then you have a conversation with someone and they've come at it with a completely different perspective. And that's really something I've found with mapping and kind of my journey through mapping so far, is that people come at it with such a different perspective. And that co-production element is so important to see where those opportunities for streamlining and making things a bit more efficient really are. And in terms of just making it so that it's relevant to people and that they will continue to use it and continue to reference it. And it's been great kind of doing that development with Digital Commons in the room as well. So actually the development of the tech has been at the same time as the development of what data we're trying to get into there, which is a really nice kind of interconnection. Right. Couple more things to say, and then I will leave you in peace. Yeah, I mean, it's been, so asking these questions has been really helpful in terms of defining what data is useful. But I think the reality is that the priority tends to be driven a little bit more by capacity and what's easiest to deliver. So we do have to kind of prioritize on what we've got time for, what we've got money for. But we can think of that as part of a bigger picture. So one of the areas that we're prioritizing at the moment, if I just nip back to this one, is actually community orchards. So we're quite excited by the potential for community orchards. There's a lot of work going on around orchards and community orchards across Southwest Wales, West Wales, and our Resilient Green Spaces work, which is Pan Wales. And so what our kind of next aim around orchards is to map with polygons the orchards that are being set up through this project and any others that we already know about. And then actually map the trees, individual trees within there. So there's a lot of investment going into planting new trees. And then that will give us a library of trees and what types of trees there are in these community orchards. And then the potential from having that base data to kind of work out what's the potential production in community orchards across Wales, what trees there are, so we can kind of have a bit more knowledge about our heritage bank. And then there's other things you can think about, like so carbon capture that's available through community orchards, and green infrastructure as well, thinking about those routes and where those trees are planted, because some of them are town centre orchards as well. So Chris Higgins from the Tyfu Dyfi project in West Wales is here today as well, and we're working with them. So we're trying to be kind of a little bit even more collaborative, even more than the Resilient Green Space Partnership, in order to look at getting their heritage, they're more of a focus on heritage orchards, getting them mapped on here as well, and working with another project down in Pembrokeshire who are working in a more commercial sense and getting those orchards mapped on as well. And so just really trying to bring in as much data as possible at this stage, and trying to have consistency across there, and that developing that consistency by these early stage discussions. So I think that's probably enough whittling from me. Lynn, I don't know if you had anything else that you wanted to add. I have just popped our contact details on there if anyone did want to speak to either of us, and we'll share the slides afterwards. I assume that's okay, Maddie. But yeah, thank you for letting me letting me have a chat.
Thank you, Alison. Fantastic. I have just said if anybody has any questions to add them in the chat. I'm interested that there's a link to a Norwegian toolkit there. So EU toolkit rather, but it's from a Norwegian collaborator. So we might be able to hear from you in a minute, Sebastian. Thanks for adding that. There's one question here from Anna, which is specifically about the orchard mapping, Alison. So is there a specific person for Anna to talk?
Who's the contact for?
Yeah, if you come through me for the time being, because we're just working with Lynn on the development that needs to go in first, and then we're going to kind of communicate out a bit wider. But we're working with, sorry, I don't know who the question came from and who you might know, but someone
From
called Anna.
In
Someone based, Angharad Owen, who's based up in Bangor Way in Gwynedd, and she's going to be looking at kind of developing some of that. But in terms of orchards, also work with Witch Hazel down your way, so she'll be communicating some of the stuff. Yeah.
Okay, good. And Witch Hazel's got your contact info?
Yes. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? I love what you said, Alison, about land is a common good that should deliver shared benefits for everyone.
I absolutely pinched that digital commons, but it's a great starting point. Really great starting point for that business. Yeah. And
I also like that this is a whole food system project, that there's so many different elements to it. So you've got the food hub with the open food network, the orchards, the different communities. It's really an incredible project. So I'm looking forward to hearing how it goes. Were there issues at the beginning because it was COVID, right? You had problems at the start.
So not, it's kind of as we came out of COVID. So a lot, our kind of full project application was written during COVID. So it was quite based on doing virtual stuff, and we've adapted slightly. But I think by the time we started delivery, people were quite used to doing a lot of virtual stuff. And I think actually post-COVID, by having a lot of meetings virtually, it's enabled us to have a much stronger partnership with people based across Wales, and even some people from England coming in and actually having much better, stronger relationships than they would do had we had to rely on email and physical meetups.
So I'd just like to ask something about the local authority relationships. Would you like to say anything about that, and where that's worked, where that's been a good way in? Who've been the key connectors within your local authorities that you've dealt with? Because I'm aware you're dealing with more than one, right?
Yeah, so there's 22 local authorities across Wales, and I'm certainly not the expert. I'm not the connection for any of them. So we at Social Farms and Gardens, we run the Community Land Advisory Service, which supports community groups and also landowners to access land, and looks at the leases and or tenancies that might be needed to be put in place in order to kind of enable community land use for growing of land. Part of that has been about trying to influence policy and making the access to public owned land a bit more straightforward and a bit more transparent, so that opportunity is available to more people, and it's an easier process for both communities but also local authorities. I mean, one of the things that we do find is that for example, you may have an allotments officer within a local authority, but they'll have that as long with a huge other job title of what they've got to do, and they could be in parks, they could be in, they could be in all sorts of different departments. And because food is so integral and land sits across so many different areas, those kind of relationships are really important. And actually that shouldn't be the way. It should be accessible to everyone. So really trying to share good practice. And Rhondda Cynon Taf, which is one of the councils in South Wales, has got a good more transparent system for kind of it's almost like a community asset transfer, but of land rather than of buildings, and a much simpler process there, which is a nice example that we try and share with others. Working with Cardiff County Council around mapping their land, and actually what we have found is that's been quite difficult. It's taken a very, very long time, and it's taken up a lot of resource within the council, and that resource has been diverted away from other areas where potentially it could have been better used. So I think one of the things that we're trying to do is to make life as easy as possible for local authorities, not requiring them to map their land, but looking at what information we can share from a community's perspective, and making it available in a way that is useful for them, and that they can then, so then they're more inclined to come to us for information.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'd like to hear more about Rhonda, but we're running out of time. There's a question from Jules. How's data being collected? To what degree is it crowdsourced? Can participants add to your map?
So at the moment we're just on sample data, so it's sourced by Social Farms and Gardens and the partners in the Resilient Green Spaces project and the groups that we're working with. But the idea is that, yes, I think as of next week, Lynn, potentially there'll be opportunity for people to add their data, but we are looking to do that in quite a structured way, to kind of maintain a little bit of the integrity of it. So just trying to balance allowing everyone to add their own data, but also keeping the integrity of what is in there. So we're going to be doing that in quite a methodical way, with the orchards as our kind of guinea pigs, and getting the people on the ground to map their orchards and then plot what trees are in there, and then developing guidance out of that that can then be used for allotments for community growers. Because also I think it's recognizing that a site may not just be a community garden. They might have an orchard there, they might have allotments, they might be doing a bit of community supported agriculture, and they'll also have a building that's for a children's centre, for example. So it's a mapping that is not just about a pinpoint, it's about what's on that site, and the people who are there know that information best.
Brilliant, thank you. Finally, just could you put a link in? Sophie from Oxford said, I went looking for the map but couldn't find it. So maybe could you have a link to that map that you shared?
Not just yet. Again, next week. It's in the next iteration that it'll be out, and it's all part of that, allowing people to be able to put the edits in there. And it's something Lynn's scurrying away in the background, getting ready.
Okay,
but we will share it through this group. Sorry, Lynn.
Yeah, we can certainly give people permission to access the map. It's not publicly available, partly for the data integrity at the moment, but if people want access, we can give people access to it.
Grand, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Lovely. I am handing back to Maddie, or am I continuing this bit?
Yeah, I can just transition us into the break. We're going to take 5 minutes to get a cup of tea, have a stretch, and I'm going to put the Mentimeter up on the screen for you to read during the break if you want to. We can share it afterwards as well. And thanks to those who put links in the chat, including a link to the Wales Real Food and Farming Conference, which is next week, if any of you are interested in joining for that.
Just to say that I know Jo has to leave at 12, so we really want to hear from her and the Lambeth story. So don't be too long with your break.
Yeah, we'll come back so it's 11:27. We'll come back at 11:32.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Alison. See you shortly.
Oh, wow. Are you scrolling through those?
It
Is
does it
scrolling
automatically.
automatically, yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure how to mute while I'm screen sharing, so you might hear my kettle. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you managed to have a little stretch and a cup of tea, some water.
Yes.
I'm going to welcome now Joe Farrow, who came in right at the beginning, who was one of the sort of initiators, in a way, this project that she worked on with Janie at the very beginning of creating our Mappers community of practice. Along with Mark and his work in Lambeth, this was the first two projects that shared with each other what they had been doing to sort of co-inspire each other. And that was the beginning of the Foodland Mappers community. So I'd like to hand over to you, Joe, to talk to us about your partnership with Incredible Edible Lambeth. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Maddie. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thanks for the intro. That was really thorough. And thanks, Alison, as well for your presentation. A hard act to follow. So I'm going to quickly race through because I actually have to dash in the next half an hour. But I'm going to speak to you about Lambeth Plots, which is a project that was initiated with Incredible Edible Lambeth in 2020, right at the start of the pandemic. And I'm a local resident, so it was really inspired through my interest in community engagement and just supporting families and individuals that were struggling through the pandemic as a volunteer. And then it materialized into a project through ARIP, and we got some funding, a small pot of funding, about £15,000, to just initiate this mapping project in Lambeth. And it was really to identify disused and underperforming urban spaces in the borough, using open source data and citizen-led mapping. And like Alison, we also had to pivot enormously because before, as we were discussing, the pandemic was coming to an end in 2021. So we had devised a proposal that was very much about verifying land physically with volunteers. So everything had to move over to virtual, and that's where we developed a crowdsourcing mapping tool. So a digital product to support the project, to continue the project on the ground. So why Lambeth was chosen? As I said, I've already got a vested interest as a local resident. My background is in landscape architecture. So sustainable human places is really just the name of the game for me. My parents are also farmers, so there's always been a really strong relationship with food from the onset. So Lambeth itself has some very shocking statistics, and this only came to the forefront when I started listening in on mutual aid calls, and the picture started to materialize. I'm originally from Africa. I grew up in Mozambique and Zimbabwe, so I thought I had seen poverty and hunger, but yet the 5th richest country, if we're still that, is experiencing very high levels of deprivation and poverty, and regular food hunger in the community. Up to 50% of children are experiencing hunger in the borough, 20 on a regular basis, and 50% are living in poverty. So there's high levels of obesity, lack of open space, very high density, which leads to that, and underutilized land, as we've seen through the mapping results, that there's quite a bit of underutilized urban land, even though it is prime real estate in the city. It could be working harder. The next thing is, so the project aims for this Lambeth Plots was to identify the potential as well as the existing food growing map to build a comprehensive map. We did realize there were a lot of community food growing that wasn't represented digitally or online. So a lot of missed opportunities. And the real crux of the project was to create a methodology that was scalable from start to finish and could be replicated in other boroughs across the UK. The mapping process itself had 5 different phases. So the first phase was collecting the data, ranking the indicators, using GIS to analyze, and then a 4th overlay of citizen-led mapping to fill the gaps and reveal potential future projects. And the data collection methods were open source data, and then the crowdsourcing data. And within the crowdsourcing data, we had 2 options as well, because we realized there was we had to cater for digitally excluded individuals to participate in this project. So we had an analog version, and we teamed up with a food charity to distribute and get people involved, as well as getting out in their local community, especially around the time of the pandemic when people were very locked in. So this is these three maps are the result of some of the analysis. The first one looks at areas of greatest social and physical need for food growing, and the areas of red are areas in highest need. And we used various data indicators for this, such as poor access to open space, food desert data, prevalence of food banks, and high areas of deprivation, and high density as well. And then on the map on the right, we overlaid unsuitable areas and extracted that, and that has everything to do with air quality data. We also have land contamination data. We know the limitations of this in the sense that it's incomplete, but it's something to build on and work on in the future. As well as main roads, all the roads, and any land use that is not feasible for food growing. And then the last map is sort of an inverse of that, is the suitable food growing spaces, and this was all done in-house desktop research within Arab. The next one is the overlay of the crowdsourcing maps together with the potential food growing locations that are already available online. And we came up with about 10 different food space typologies, which people could access through the crowdsourcing map, which had a very simple form entry to just give us an idea of the type of spaces they were mapping. A photograph could be added, and then just general size. If the space was paved or vegetated, that kind of data that kind of surfaced, and then we overlaid that on the GIS map to reveal 5 very key areas of potential food growing spaces. So this is the results of the citizen-led mapping. And what's really interesting here is that we got about 120 points, hopefully not done by one person, hard to know. And of those spaces, we did a best case scenario calculation and a worst case scenario calculation based on the smallest and the largest size. Because the unit of measure is not very universal or accessible to people, because I'm a spatial designer, so that's my terminology. So we used the size of a car park, a parking bay, to measure the sizes. So it could be anywhere. It was just like a ballpark figure. So at the best case scenario, we saw there was about 1.5 hectares of land available, and based on very contradictory sources, because no one really knows how much land can actually feed a person daily. But we did come to a conclusion that 1.5 hectares could feed about 21 individuals on a veg-based diet for 1 year. And at the worst case scenario, 6 individuals. And one thing that I have to mention about this project was that it was a very accelerated project, and it was really just to test the concept and to test the tool and to really get the ball rolling. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned, a lot of gaps to be filled, but the foundations are really there to keep building on and refining. Sorry, that's not citizen-led mapping. So in terms of the timeline of our project, the literature that exists that fed into the Lambeth food growing, the Lambeth plots, which is the phase 1 of the project that I've just been talking about. Anything to do with, we've got the Lambeth Food Poverty and Insecurity Action Plan, and we've got the London Food Strategy, and many colleagues within Arab have also have been involved in the 100 Resilient Cities and devising resilient food systems for London and global cities as well. So we fed all that information, all that literature into our project. We also realized that city authorities are increasingly recognizing the importance of food and making it a focus in their city strategies. But we also recognize that food growing is predominantly citizen driven. So the opportunity for our next phase after the Lambeth plots is to bring bottom-up food growing with strategic city priorities to systemically increase urban food production and using a scalable and replicable model. So our next phase, which Janie has been involved in, I've been on maternity leave for about a year now, so I'm a little bit fuzzy on the details, but I'll jump back onto the global challenge, which is the second phase of the Lambeth plots. It was about, we submitted for a internal global competition and access some funding to progress the project for another 2 years. So the second phase is really to pilot a project in Lambeth, and then with the third phase, potentially scaling that across different geographies globally. And to do that, we would need a global team of experts within Arup that would help us contextualize mapping in their regions, access to data or lack of. So really to build a very diverse framework based on, so to create a roadmap for communities and local councils to accelerate food growing is essentially what we're trying to do here. And the project's focus is on community health, looking at challenges facing communities and food growing in neighborhoods, building strong networks with local authority. And luckily within Lambeth, we've really started to crystallize that. There's the Lambeth Food Partnership that's currently having a reboot, and we're really around the table. We're all around the table from Arup and Incredible Edible to really start seeing the impacts of that to ripple through the community. Another key focus is continue identifying and unlocking a land for food growing within Lambeth, and the framework to develop is to, as I say, the framework is to accelerate and increase access to food growing within the local, in people's localities. Well, this is a very heavy, dense slide, but it really just shows you the 4 pillars and the strength of partnerships with local communities, as well as local authority and public sector. So this has moved away from mapping, but mapping is very integral to the beginning process of how communities can organize themselves, identify the barriers, how to access information and information about place and land ownership is really quite part of it. So the key barriers to increasing food production in Lambeth, and for the purpose of this audience, we'll just look at place. We did find that there was a lack of collated and publicly available information on suitable food growing spaces. Access to land for food growing is in a highly privatized economy, and it's always kind of being pushed to the back burner. Now we're in the cost of living, and again, we're seeing conversations kind of slow down and priorities keep shifting. So that's always quite a struggle for the project's continuity and really kickstarting food growing projects in communities and accessing funding. There's a high demand in greening neighborhoods, and that doesn't necessarily mean that food growing is, again, a high priority typology to be injected into neighborhoods. And high demand for food. There's high demand for food growing because allotments have waiting lists for years, and so we're trying to work with other local businesses. Like Allotme is another business model that is basically an Airbnb for leasing your back garden. So maybe there's opportunities there to in a privatized setting to increase food growing and have more food growing residents coming up through the ranks with support from Incredible Edible and organizations like that. And then we also found that there were many food insecure neighborhoods in high density areas and have poor access to open space. So those are really just the barriers that we've encountered. And that's me. So a very long presentation. I'm sorry about that.
No, not at all, Jo. That was fantastic.
Thanks.
Please, if you do have any questions, add them. There is a question here from Neil about the analysis of where the greater need existed. Is that methodology available? I would say it is available.
Yes. I mean, the whole idea is to keep all our research open source.
So how could we share that with Neil?
We do have an impact report. Maybe we could start there. We could share that with you. Yeah.
Okay. So
you've got my email there. So if you want to just get in touch.
And is this a question from Linda? Yes, it is. I'd like to know how you dealt with the challenges doing this work in highly privatized environments, how to go around that and find place, create relationships. I mean, interestingly, a large amount of the available land, Linda, is owned by the local authority. And we find at Incredible Edible Lambeth that is the land that we are really focusing on, because at the moment there's nothing going on in that land. Jo, do you want to say anything about that?
Sure. In the suitable food growing map, we used big landowners as an opportunity. So once we have a relationship and a dialogue with a big landowner, then the impact is a lot higher if we manage to convince them to unlock more projects for food growing.
Yeah, and Jo mentioned AllotMe, so they're more focused on private chunks of land, so it might be worth you looking at AllotMe. There's a question from Wendy. How did you recruit citizens? Interesting one, because that was tricky, and Jo, you probably got something to say about that, the kind of demographic of those people who added data. Yeah, exactly. So of course, Incredible Edible have a massive membership. So we started there. And we posted things through Incredible Edible website, and we also submitted a couple of publications, right, to online local news agencies just to advertise. But we did find, once the results started to come through, we started to realize that the places of greatest need and the crowdsourcing information were just not overlapping. So we did find that the demographic was white middle age, living in pretty well-off areas, and so that was another barrier. So we don't expect people experiencing hardships such as high deprivation and unemployment and health struggles and all that to grow their food. It's just too time consuming. So part of the second phase of the project is to really look at models of supporting one another, from leisurely food growing to finding an ecosystem where food can be exchanged and shared with people in need. Any more questions for Joanna? You've done it in good time. 7 minutes to spare.
Oh, good. Maybe I should have slowed down a little bit.
Oh, no, that's good. I'm very pleased to have Cassidy Travis here from Lambeth Local Authority. So I'm really hoping that Cassidy can kind of relay some of this information back to the council. As Alison said, so much of this cuts across so many different departments within local authorities, and yet we find it very, very difficult to pinpoint the right person to connect with, to enable more of this activity to take place. It's a constant issue for, I think, quite a few people in the room, and it's fantastic when you find somebody who absolutely can support and enable this to happen, because we need that. And just by, I think there was an interesting thing Alison said about how we cannot load any more onto our local authorities. They are so burdened with everything that's going on. And so we have to make it super easy, and we have to show that mapping can unlock so much for them in terms of many of their action plans, whether it's climate change, biodiversity, food action plans. And if through our work we're supporting that, their targets, then what's to lose? Oh, Marge tells me Cassidy's left. That's a shame. Anyway, she can hear the recording, and we're sharing it with Vida Cunningham, who is public health at Lambeth, who also sadly had an emergency this morning. Great. Maddie, you go.
Yeah, I just wonder whether there's a few things that come up around the importance of collaboration and about actually the diversity within food growing types, that a lot of the time when you talk to, we find, and I'm sure some of you find as well, that when talking to local authorities about food growing, there's a sort of default to allotment officers, maybe small holdings, and doing more allotments. And I think what's really important is about going beyond that and finding ways to go to open out the full typology. Allotments themselves and the diversity, the potential for diversity within allotments, and co-run allotments, but also community food growing, small enterprise CSAs. There's a full range, orchards, forest gardens, all the perennial stuff. There's a huge diversity. So it's really important to hold that in mind when having these conversations. And we did a piece of work on typology, which is on the UAC website as well. And there's other really great work on urban agriculture typologies out there to draw on. And just really remarking on the shocking statistics around poverty. How bad does it need to get before we really start bringing food up the land use hierarchy within urban and peri-urban areas? Short supply chains, take the food to the people, and it's not only the growing, but also the community kitchens, the other infrastructure, the hubs, the accessibility, the processing, and how we do all of that much more locally and much more accessibly. So all of that is very much brought to life through these mapping processes, and particularly through collaborating on these mapping processes and bringing lots of different data together and really make a place come alive, and the potential of a place come alive as well. Just bringing in Pete, I think, from Leeds, which is wonderful. So we are just coming up to 12. I think
Jamie's just arrived, I think.
Great. So this is the Leeds contingent, which is great to see you all. I wondered if at this point, Simon, if you're in the house, if you had any snippet of reflection on mapping from a planning point of view. How do maps impact on plans, on planning? It's a big question, but in case you had anything that was just bubbling up.
It's a huge question.
Sorry.
No, sorry, I'm slightly on the spot. But I think my one reflection is that the really interesting thing to be able to attempt to do is to try and take the kind of information that we've been looking at this morning and apply them in the context of a local plan, and make specific allocations for food growing land in the different kind of varieties. And there's a few different mechanisms in how that could be done. And certainly where local authorities undertake something called a green space assessment. And the idea of that is to kind of look at the different categories of green space within their area. And certainly my view is that could potentially accommodate different types of growing land, be it commercial or community gardens or allotments. But I'm not aware of that necessarily getting too far at present anyway, but I'm obviously delighted to be corrected on that. Yeah, I think that's my reflection for the moment.
That's brilliant. So there are really strong connections between mapping processes and planning processes, and that segues us beautifully into Leeds, who are currently doing a local plan review, and part of that is to look at the food strategy for Leeds and how that interfaces with the local plan. I'm really pleased to introduce Emily, who is leading with Jamie, who I think is also here on the mapping work in Leeds. We also have Neil from the council there and Pete from Hyde Park Source, who are all collaborating on some fantastic mapping work in Leeds. So I'll pass over to you. Do you need me to, can you share your screen if you need to? I think everyone can, they need to. So over to you, Emily, if you're ready.
Pete, do you want me to kick off or? Yeah.
Oh, you're muted.
Oh, sorry,
Pete.
you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, that'd be great if you could kick off. Yeah.
Okay, I'll just quickly summarize what we've been doing. So yeah, with my colleague Jamie, I don't think he's here because he's got some time difference. He's based in New Zealand at the moment. We have started to get interested in mapping and obviously, yeah, join the Urban Agriculture Consortium mapping gatherings some months back. And that was, yeah, we realized the potential of mapping to increase local food growing. And we tried to get this information, to get this data in Leeds from the Leeds local authority, asked various people, and we realized how difficult it was and how this data wasn't available. So we didn't have the maps available of where the land is, who it is owned by, and yeah, that data is crucial to kind of understand where we can have increased local food growing. And we held our first event back at the end of September, where Maddie was present there as well, and Pete as well, and others were involved in this project. And we basically wanted to bring together the growing community in Leeds and local authorities and mappers to kind of be in the same room together and find out about the potential to do this work for Leeds. And so, yeah, we aim to map this data on an open software. We want to use the Land Explorer platform, which I don't know if it's been talked about before. Sorry, I could only join now. And Pete has been leading on the work with pushing the local authority to make it more simple for communities to access that land. So to facilitate the processes, because there's different agreements and it's quite difficult for communities to work on that land. And we have Neil Webber as well, who's been helping us is, well, Neil, you can say some words if you want afterwards, but has been really kindly offering support from the local authority, showing us the maps they have and the work they want to do, and whether they can add also different indicators on the map that the maps they are doing around green infrastructure. Like Maddie said, at the minute we have a huge opportunity in Leeds with the local plan update, the consultation for that new piece of document, to bring in mapping as an essential tool for local food uptake, local food growing in Leeds. And we also have a food strategy that is also talking about increasing local food production. So with those key documents, we can bring in mapping as an essential tool for that. So yeah, I'll just pass over to Pete.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Yeah, sorry, I could only just join just now. Yeah, so without knowing what you've already covered, I'll just talk about what we're doing in Leeds. So me and Emily are both part of the Climate Action Leeds project, which if you're more interested in, there's the website which gives you the full picture, but it's got really broad aims, and that means it allows us to do interesting projects that just come up. And I was saying in the meeting last week, on the pre-meeting to this, it feels a bit like I've fallen down a mapping wormhole, and it's not actually my day job. So but it is really interesting, and I'm quite inspired by the potentials of it. When Neil was talking at our event, and hopefully Neil will talk to this in a minute, but he was explaining how he uses data sets to inform policy and make decisions on planning, but quite often they're really big data sets that are obviously wrong if you know the locality. So, and that made us start thinking about the Land Explorer and how we could do things from a sort of more grassroots up level. So our organisations facilitate several community gardens, and we do design and build work with local communities to improve green spaces, and we do outdoor education with primary schools, and we're part of the sort of network in Leeds, like the permaculture network and the green activity provider network, and all supporting each other to do grassroots, community-led, environment-based work. And the idea was, well, if we've got a central map that is open source, easy to use, and we can either upskill people to input their own projects onto that map, or get them to share the data and we can easily put it on that map, then we could get like a Wikipedia style map of food growing or nature-based projects for Leeds, get a really rich data set, which then can be plugged into other mapping software. And and just as a process, I think that's really exciting. And there's a movement in Leeds around specific bits to do with food growing, especially because of the food strategy. But we've got a sort of broader remit of nature-based projects. I was at another network meeting yesterday where we're talking about how we better link to social prescribing in the NHS, and we're thinking about how we could use data sets and maps on a holding website. And so there's all these ideas. I think the thing with maps, and you've probably already covered this, is it's like a snapshot, and unless you update it, then it quickly becomes a bit useless. So it needs to be like low maintenance, or if there's like one spreadsheet or data set that is updating multiple maps, then it sort of needs to be useful in the long term, I think, to invest the time in it. And I suppose from where we're coming from, we're like on the ground doing the community nature-based projects, and we're really interested in how this digital stuff could like link into policy and make bigger changes, but understanding how the technicalities of that work isn't our forte. So I think that's why we all need to work together. Maybe that's a good way to pass over to Neil, who I think does have digital skills.
Thanks, Pete. So I'm Neil Webber, and I work in the strategic planning service of Leeds City Council as a GIS data person. So we're the service that I work in is currently undertaking the first part of the local plan update, the LPU1. I'm not here kind of representing the council. I'm here. I just happen to work for the council, and this is a subject that interested me when sort of Emily and Jamie sort of found their way to me. And that's probably, somebody mentioned it before, the difficulty of finding the right person in a council with which to sort of get some kind of local authority mandate to talk about these things. I don't know if such a person exists in Leeds, which, you know, is perhaps speaks to the size of the authority and the difficulty that we have of knowing everybody. But so I've got access to a lot of data, which is not as open as it should be. Well, you know, Leeds, we would certainly put our hands up sort of straight away and say that's not something that we've done very well in the past. We're working hard to change that. So I'm kind of hoping that we'll be able to publish a lot of data sort of openly and in usable formats fairly soon. There's definitely an opportunity in Leeds at the moment, because we make significant use of location intelligence, spatial analysis in formulating our local plans, and the current LPU1 update is kind of the strategic level plan update, and we're so kind of high level policies around climate change, zero carbon, renewable energy, 20-minute neighborhoods is a big thing that's kind of come into sort of real focus, obviously following the pandemic, and it's been taken really seriously actually in Leeds as a way of planning a city, and what is it that the planning department can do to try and make that kind of thing a reality. So there is at the moment there's scope to try and influence the decisions that the planners in Leeds make through LPU about those kind of higher level things, to get food growing, urban food growing, sort of on the agenda, which it probably isn't specifically in the material at the moment from my sort of fairly limited understanding of the actual sort of planning documents themselves. There's kind of too much of that for me to read and understand. But so there's certainly opportunity to make representations to that plan, and it fits very well with the current direction of travel, I think, in Leeds at the moment in planning, the way that the strategic planning service are looking at this. And then following on from that, in the new year, there's the second part of the local plan update, which will involve actual call for sites, you know, sites to inform, to actually make the policies that have been set out in LPU1 sort of into reality on the ground. So I thought one of the things that I am doing at the moment is building a map-based survey form that will ask for people to submit sites to the process. And traditionally a call for sites is seen in kind of narrow terms of housing sites, employment sites, that kind of thing. But we decided just yesterday, in fact, to kind of widen that out and to ask for people to submit sites for other things as well, like sites that they think are suitable for tree planting or habitat banking, that kind of use. So I can very easily see that one of the choices on the form, what do you want to submit your site for, could be urban food growing, and we could do that. So that's the kind of, I think, focus that we have at the moment and the possibilities. But yeah, there's great potential in all of the data we have. It's just finding the time resource to kind of look through that, particularly on something the scale of Leeds. It's, you know, it's hard to do. Sorry, that's me waffling on for quite a long time. But
I think one thing that's really interesting about the way that you're working together is that you're looking at how the data the data kind of comes in to the map, but also what flows out of it, what happens next in terms of how do people actually access the land once if it's mapped, if it's designated, how might it then, what does that mean in practice in terms of then transitioning that into productive space and looking at what are the processes that need to happen to ensure all these sites can be managed. Let's say there's a portfolio of food growing sites that comes forward and keeps coming forward. How can that be managed in a way that unburdens the local authority and doesn't burden them more? And we've been looking at the possibility of land trusts to manage urban foods, portfolio of urban food growing sites, because there's a huge amount of potential in terms of when you can gather it, see it, manage it as a whole. You can also measure it as a whole. You can also measure the biodiversity increase, the carbon sequestration, how many, the nutrient density of the food, the quality of the soil, all these things. You can set a bar about the quality of the food that is produced and its accessibility and the biodiversity, the agroecological dimensions of that. It's not any old food growing. There's definitely climate impacts and biodiversity impacts that can all be managed and monitored when you take this portfolio of sites as a whole. I think leading from the map to the planning and through to the management it's really important to see that as a whole.
The work I've been doing with land access stuff with the council and specifically with someone in housing, it's been really interesting. There's been a lot of back and forth, but one of the things that she's pushed back on is that if they're going to give permission for a group to take on management of a site in some way through a license or a lease or something, they need to know that that group has the right legal structure, but also has longevity and has a continuity and a togetherness. It isn't just like someone who's really enthusiastic and then they're going to move or something, and then they need to, because it is a risk for them, is the way that she says. It's like they can't just agree with everything that comes along. They need like a really well thought out plan. So I think some of the work for organisations like Hyde Park Source is building capacity in those groups, where it might just be, say, it might be people who live locally who see a bit of land and they want to do something interesting, but they're not formed as a legal entity yet, and they've not worked together before, so they haven't got those. So it's about building capacity as well, because there's not loads of groups of people who've got all the food growing knowledge and the working together as an organisation, the interpersonal skills. There's all those sort of stuff where we need to build capacity on the ground as land becomes available, and I think that's the sort of some of the work that needs to be done, to scale it up, because it's a bit like we were involved in a project during COVID as a research project called Leeds Patchwork Farm, where the idea was that there'd be loads of small places growing in an organised way, but then we were like, well, there's no land and there's not that many growers because there's no land, because there's not many growers, because and then we're like, so you sort of need things to move sort of together, like incrementally together. If there was suddenly loads of land available for urban food growing on a commercial scale, there probably isn't the people with the skills in Leeds to do that. People might move to Leeds because they'll be like, wow, Leeds is amazing, there's land, but you get my point. I think there is work to be done on building capacity to do the work.
Yeah, thank you, Pete. Thank you, Lisa. Are there any further questions specifically about Leeds? And I think, what you're saying, Pete, is really important about scaling up, because what this is really about is that we're living in a time where we're seeing our familiar food systems moving towards greater collapse. with climate change, climate extremes, and many other biodiversity collapse and so on. So this relocalization project of food, the regions, the local, the peri-urban, is really about sovereignty, food sovereignty, and how we can all collectively create a food system that will withstand some of those harsh realities in the coming years. And that journey a map is a very important part of the beginning of that journey. I'm going to, we're coming to our final bit, and I'd like to invite Mark to step back in again and give us some reflections on, Mark, what you've heard. Yeah, how do we draw this session to a close? Over to you.
Thanks, Maddie, and thanks to all our speakers this morning. It's been really, really interesting and very inspiring, because just kind of getting a bit more information about the backgrounds to these projects is really important. And I think it's really important, particularly for those of us on the call today who are at the start of their mapping journey. And I'm sure that you've all gained some useful insight. But in the context of those beginners, what I'd like to do is just kind of run through a few questions that you might want to ask and things you might want to consider, and really kind of bring those out in the context of what our three groups have been talking about. Now, I think the first question is, why are we mapping? This is a really important thing to start with. And I really liked Alison's take that the point of mapping is to translate food strategy into land use decisions. And this is a theme that kind of, I think, runs right the way through all of our presentations this morning, that it's about decision making. And as Neil was saying, Neil from Leeds was saying just a moment ago, maps are key to local plans and therefore to planning decisions and to the planners. So it is a language that people involved in making decisions about land are familiar with, and that's one reason why we do it. Although Joanna, I think, gave us some interesting insights into also the kind of the community aspect, and actually using maps as a way of communicating to communities points of access to nature, and to kind of get a sense of where land is within an area, and really just trying to scale it. I mean, I was struck that they identified 2,000 hectares of land within Lambeth that had potential food growing. Another thing that Emily mentioned I thought was really interesting, why map? You map if the data is not available. And she mentioned that when they approached Leeds City Council originally, they couldn't get access to the data, partly obviously because they didn't know Neil at that point, but also you know, the data that someone like Neil would be able to share is somewhat restricted. So sometimes you do need to go back to basics and collect the data. Once you've decided why you're going to map, you need to think about who will use your map. And obviously, as we've talked about, that these are decision makers, particularly within the local authority, but also local residents and local communities. It's a means of communication across all of those groups. But once you start thinking about who will use your map, something starts to emerge of, well, you've got this map data, how do you share that? And something that Alison talked about was interoperability, which is a bit of a technical term, but really there's no point having lots of data in a system if you can't share that. And the different user groups you might be talking to, the different stakeholders, will have different range of expertise. Some will be familiar with GIS software, some most definitely will not be. So you need to give your basic user groups some consideration from the outset, not only in terms of who will use your data, but how will they use it. And this kind of starts us to think about how accurate the data actually needs to be. Again, something that really struck me that Alison said was when talking about the orchards, you don't just put an orchard on a map as a pinpoint, because the world is much more complex than that. You know, an orchard may be part of a larger farm. There may be buildings around. There's a lot of information that you sometimes need to that you want to imbue the map with, and sometimes that's not possible. So actually trying to scope out that information is really important, and the complexity of the world and the way in which we try and capture that complexity on a map can lead to problems. So Neil was talking about when they were looking at some data, it was clearly wrong, and it'd be wrong and thereby inaccurate, and it would be wrong because maybe the land parcel had changed. Maybe the data wasn't collected accurately or appropriately in the first place. And one of the things about map data in particular to bear in mind is that because it can be visualized, people are able to make an instant assessment of the accuracy. So if you've got your boundaries wrong on a land parcel, or you name it inaccurately, or you say you describe it inaccurately, people looking at this information will go, well, that's wrong. And if they, from their particular local knowledge, assess that some data is wrong, they'll assume that everything in your data set is wrong. And that again goes back to the first point of why you're mapping, to influence decision makers. One of those decision makers happens to know an area of a town quite well, and the data you're presenting is inaccurate, you're going to undermine the power of your argument. Similarly, Joanna was talking about how with the Arup project, they're looking to extend it, and something I've never heard of, but I quite like the idea of an Airbnb for back gardens for food growing, maybe so local businesses can kind of get involved and maybe utilize some of that land for food growing. Well, if you do that, you've got to make sure your data is accurate, because you're going to be entering some sort of agreement with a local business or whomever. And if your data is inaccurate, you might, dare I say, you might be liable in some way, shape or form. So in terms of sourcing and capturing the data, something that struck me in all of these projects was there was an initial phase of desk-based research, actually getting some core data sets to start populating a map, and that's certainly something I would recommend. Can I ask who, someone's got their mic on there. When you start a project like this, it's really helpful to have some core data, and that can be sourced from a whole host of different sources. Some of those sources will be locked up. And Neil was talking about how those data sets can be locked up in local authorities, even if they want to release them. But often there are a lot of open data sources that you can actually use to start populating your map with. But often we will be engaging with communities, with citizen scientists, to actually collect the data, and that in turn will start to make us think about the sort of technology that we might want to employ. And I was, it was nice to see that Land Explorer was mentioned in two of the projects, and also in the Lambeth project, actually having an app, a specific piece of technology to capture information on land parcels was really interesting, and in some senses represents the far end of the technological scale. But I was also struck that it needed to be backed up with paper maps. And I think that's something for us all to bear in mind. It's in terms of the accessibility to digital technology. And let's face it, sometimes paper maps are not all that bad. And in fact, I would say sometimes, particularly in terms of communication, a paper map is sometimes much more powerful than a map presented in a GIS or in an online setting. So I'd certainly recommend that you kind of bear that analog backup as being particularly useful. But whether it's in a paper map or whether it's in a digital setting, the data you've got will go out of date. And that was something that Pete mentioned. He talked about the map is a snapshot, and that's very, very true. Once you collect that information, it's getting old, or it's going stale, and that data needs curation and looking after and maintaining. Again, particularly if you want to inform decision makers, if you're taking information into a meeting to talk about a local plan and your data's out of date, then you're going to be on the back foot right from the start.
Mark, just one more minute.
Okay, yeah, I'm nearly there. And something, if you're collecting information from via citizen scientists, then the whole point of actually having consistency of data collection, this is something that Alison mentioned in terms of the orchard data collection, is really important. And also just a shout out to Wendy Felstadt, who said that in her project in Norway, citizen scientists needed to be looked after. And that is all part of the whole data curation process to ensure that your data is of the highest quality. And finally, this again might seem a bit sad, but right from the start, you need to plan the end of your mapping project. You need to know how you can close it down. You don't want to be in a position of just abruptly finishing the project, trying to figure out how you're going to get your data out, because again, you want to get your data out of systems if they're digital and share them. And I'll just kind of wind up on again a note that Pete made when talking about food growing projects and the way in which local authorities can be reluctant to hand over land to community growers, because they want to know that there's longevity. They want to know that this is not just a flash in the pan, that it is going to go on forever. And in the same way that we need to think about that in terms of food, the growing of food and community growing of food, that they do go on for a long time, I think we also need to give that a lot of consideration when we're starting to create maps too.
Thanks so much, Mark. That's just fantastic wrap up. It's been a very rich session. I really liked what I think it was Pete was saying about how we should contact councillors. Sorry, it was Neil. That councillors are a great way of lobbying for change. I've noted that one. Because we mostly all know our local councillors. Yeah, so great session, so many things to think about. If you're thinking about mapping, please do join our Foodland Mappers group. There's around 30 of us who dip in and out of these sessions. We have a session about once a quarter. If you'd like to find out more, the next session is on Wednesday, the 30th of November. I think it's a Wednesday at 2 o'clock. And just email me I will put my email in there was a slide, but I'm going to put it in the chat. So it's, it would be great to hear, there we go, foodlandmappers@gmail.com, or contact Maddie. If you'd like to find out more about this group, or whether you'd like to share your project with the group, that would be fantastic too. I know we've gone over 12:30, so Maddie, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, just a massive thank you to everybody for spending this time with us, for doing the work that you're doing and sharing your projects and inspiring us. And it's it's amazing to be sort of bringing this kind of forming more of a network always and weaving your work together. And I think there's such a power in acting as a community of mappers, and then all of the different components of that go into that, and all of the potential inherent in those maps and what can flow from them. Yeah, do drop in on the 10th. We'll hold that as an open space for any of you who want to follow up from this session. Essentially
30th of November, we said.
Sorry, what did I say? 30th
Yeah.
of November.
30th of November, 2 o'clock. So
Yeah.
just email me and I'll add you to the list. I've put my email in the chat.
And we'll share slides and so on the Urban Agriculture Consortium website. There's a page about mapping, and we'll add a bunch of resources from this session to that page, and we'll follow up with a link as well in an email to everybody. Yeah, so thank you very much. And if you have questions that come up for any of the speakers as well, please share them with myself or Janie, and we can pass them on, and your contact details, and put you in touch with people. So yeah, I think we're there.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Nice to see you all. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thanks all.
Bye. You turn off recording.
Yeah.